This is the Graphic Elements and Image lecture for the beginning typography class. And in this lecture, we'll go over the use of graphic elements and imagery for the Type Fundamentals book, look at ways that graphic elements help designers divide content and lead the eye to specific information, as well as strategies for utilizing image, bleeding imagery, and cropping imagery in your layouts. Graphic elements are the tools used by designers to help readers navigate the content. They also can sometimes attract the eye to important information or provide clear boundaries to help divide content. These are really important tools that graphic designers use, and you'll see them very frequently throughout all kinds of graphic design work. They sometimes play a secondary role to some of the other elements in design, but they are vital to our ability to really help the viewer understand the content that they're looking at and how it relates to each other. Here's some examples of graphic elements. These are just a few of the ones that you can play with, but there's all different kinds of line work. There's single lines, dotted lines, triple lines, thick lines, thin lines, all different kinds of squares. So here's some different ones: solid line, dotted line, all different kinds of circles. And then of course, obviously you can combine these things together to create all different other types of elements as well. So for this section, really any kind of graphic element that you can use in InDesign is fair game for you to explore in your layouts. So here's a simple example of how graphic elements can be used. Here we're looking at how a paragraph indicator happens. So sometimes graphic elements will come into play and they'll be used to actually create a paragraph indicator. Like on the left, where there's a rule or a line that runs between the last sentence of a paragraph and the first sentence of the next paragraph. Or on the right, where there's this simple double arrow that's being used to denote the paragraph. So instead of having a line break or an indentation there, they're using a special glyph that is really helping the viewer see where those paragraphs begin. So these are two simple examples of how graphic elements can be used. Here's some other ones. Here's one where at the bottom of this paragraph, so if you look on the right at the bottom of the body copy, you're seeing a symbol. This is something that often happens in editorial design. Different magazines will have a symbol that really helps the viewer to note that that actually is the end of the story. But then we also have a simple box around that content at the bottom. It's a very simple ruled box that helps contain that text. Here's one that's using these thick lines to create headers. They're really helping divide the content. They're really helping us see the grid. There's also smaller line work running between each of these that's helping us connect titles to page numbers. So it's really a navigational tool. It's a structural tool that's being utilized to help us see what content is related and what goes together. Here's another simple example, the lines on the left, where they're running between these sections of coffee. This is some kind of a review or some kind of an analysis of different kinds of coffees, and they have some lines running between them so that we can see that the content stays together and that that's a new section or a new type of coffee that they're exploring. Sometimes these things are a little less functional, and they're more about creating an interesting look in the way that there's this lined rule that surrounds the typography at the top of this page. So that's something that's more decorative, it's more interesting, it's helping us see that that headline is connected together, but it's also just creating a lot of interest for the viewer. Here's line work that's more decorative. So here they're really playing with these decorative borders. The line work's actually taking over, it's becoming more dominant than the text itself. Or here's one that's creating a more deconstructive look with all this technical line work that's running on top of these illustrations, all of these little bits of rectangle and these crop marks on the corners that are helping give a certain feeling or mood to this piece. Or here's one where they're gridding typography. So here we're really playing with axis, but then this line work is really helping us delineate and divide and see where the content changes. It's helping to note headlines with these boxes and double rules. And then there's dotted lines and lines that run between the content that helps us understand and see where things connect. Because this axis layout is really complicated. There's a lot happening here. And so those lines are really key for us to understand and see what content goes together. Here's one that's, again, dividing content. There's this line work around this big piece of watermelon that's really helping us see that one of these sections is soup, one is cocktail, salad, and dessert. And so those lines really help us see these different sections that are related to different recipes that you can make with watermelon. And that really gets into infographics. Infographics really rely on these graphic elements. They're really important. And here's a great example. You can see all of these line works and circles and pie charts and lines and different elements that are really helping make this clear and easy to understand. Because an infographic's job is really to communicate effectively without a lot of words. And so those graphic elements are really key to guide the viewer to understand this content in a really efficient manner. Menus as well. We keep talking about these, but graphic elements also really help us on a menu. They help us understand what content goes with what content is a part of a certain section. It can help divide up sections so that we understand that one section is entrees and one section is desserts. So oftentimes you'll see those on complex things like menus as well. And then obviously on the web, we see rules very often in editorial design, but particularly editorial websites. So things like the New York Times or CNN, there's going to be all kinds of line work that helps divide these different articles up, that helps us see what articles are connected and which ones are not. It's going to help us delineate what is ad content and what's actually editorial content. And then we see really complicated line work like this. This is something that we often see in UI design or motion graphics. Think of sci-fi movies that you've watched and those incredible active diagram screens that they're messing on to power some spaceship or some new tool or device. And so oftentimes using a lot of graphic elements makes these things feel really complicated and complex, which is really the desired effect for these heads-up displays and different interfaces that we see in these futuristic settings. And then sometimes they're more tactile. Here's an example of a stationary system where we're seeing a lot of graphic elements, but most of them are blind embossed. So it's actually a texture, a raised surface on the paper that's being created. So instead of actually printing a lot of these graphic elements, we can feel them, which creates a really luxe and interesting brand for this person. Or sometimes they're just fun. This is this Art Central logo. It's a school, and they have all these really playful lines that come in all these different colors. They sometimes center around the actual name of the school, but other times they're just kind of a loose pattern that runs on the back of the letterhead or the business card. And they just create a really fun, creative feeling for the brand. Or here's another one where at the top we're seeing those graphic elements again that are dividing up that paragraph, that are helping us see the divisions and where different thoughts or paragraphs happen in that text above. Or here where they're emphasizing bomb in this playful way with this comic book-like burst that's being drawn in green around the word bomb. Or this engineering where there's these more organic shapes that are being used that really give it a softness and kind of a more sophisticated vibe. Or here, this record cover where you see these topographic, almost Northern Lights-like patterns that are running over this image, and they're printed in a holographic foil. So they're creating a more sense of mood, of place. It's becoming more about the style that's being created through the use of these graphic elements. Another one that's playful, these pink lines that come into the background. There's some very functional blue lines that are helping divide this content and working to help us see what part of the alphabet we're at. But then there's these playful pink lines that really just break things up and create a lot of interest for the viewer here. There's another one with lines that just come in. Some are bleeding in from the top, these yellow pieces. Some of them are more functional, denoting where copy is, but the rest are just artfully placed to create some graphic elements that have interest and draw the viewer in. Here's more of it, where you can see how they're layering on top of photographs, and they're bleeding in, and they're playing on these different colors that create a lot of interest and create a more deconstructive, kind of playful feeling for this layout. We see these for identity as well. Here's a business card that has a lot of lines. All of these lines are really helping split up all of this content. They're helping us understand what part's the phone number, what part is the email address. And that's really important because we want to be able to really quickly understand what content we're looking at and also really quickly find the content that we need. So this structured line work is really becoming a navigational device for us. It's really helping divide content and help us see what we're looking at. We'll see this a lot in lettering and typography as well. Oftentimes when we have spaces that we have trouble filling, we'll add lines or swashes to help complete and create better gestalt for the overall piece. Here's a great example for Jamestown Revival, where there's these swashes that are coming off of the J and the R that are locking up and filling those blank spaces so that this thing can lock up into a more perfect circle. Here's more work on an alcohol label. You can see all of these swashes and line work that's creating a lot of interest here. It's also making this feel a little bit more luxe, a little bit more expensive of a product. Or here, much more simple and straightforward, these lines that are under each of these headers that are really helping us understand that the material is Montana ponderosa. The series is side table. So that line is just really a navigational tool for us, or a division tool that helps us understand the system of how this type is set. Or here's some playful line work on chocolate packaging. The line work is actually made out of chocolate. So here they're actually creating and using graphic elements with the product that's inside. So it's a really clever solution. We will very often see graphic elements used on alcohol packaging, particularly wine. It gives it a more luxe kind of experience. And this is some of the work of Chad Michael Studio. He does a lot of really amazing alcohol packaging and frequently uses extensive amounts of graphic elements. So here you're seeing these lines and these borders and these different pieces that are running throughout this back of this wine label. And what's really interesting is that there's a really wide variety of the types of graphic elements that are being used. Because of the monochromatic appeal and because things feel similar in style, there's really strong unity being created. Here's another, a front of a gin bottle, where you can see just the amount of graphic elements, all of these patterns and lines and diamonds and rectangles, little flags that drop down, line work that helps divide content, line work that connects content. And it really creates a kind of chaotic but really interesting feeling for this label. Here's a gift certificate, another great example. Forms that need to be filled in often need a lot of line work to help denote where things fit. They help us know where client goes and where phone goes and what's the description. And those lines really help us understand where that content lives and how this document should be filled out. Here's some work of Kevin Cantrell. He's another amazing graphic designer. He's from Utah and does some incredible work that frequently utilizes an extensive set of graphic elements. So this was a home run bat that he did for the Major League Baseball, and it was a beautiful engraved bat that is covered in nothing but graphic elements. So obviously we can see some of the typography, but as we zoom in, you can really see all of these swashes and line work that completely cover this bat and create something that is really gorgeous and beautiful. It's really become more of a trophy than it is a bat at all. And here's some of his other work, this Commonwealth Coffee, where you can see these bands of pattern or borders that are running throughout this entire packaging. Also these interesting rules that are running on the left-hand side and this border that contains this interesting block of copy. So there's an emphasis on elements here and ornamentation that makes his work really unique and interesting. Here's a very famous piece that he did for AIGA Salt Lake City. It's for their 100 show, and you can see how this is really more plus more. He's using all these bands of pattern and borders together in this fairly monochromatic palette that creates this very luxe and interesting feeling. So this again is all about graphic elements, but they can become really powerful when they're used effectively. And here's Bethany Heck. She's maybe using things in a less ornamental way. Here we're really looking at more straightforward line work, but it's still really important in how it navigates the viewer and divides this content up in this Mobile Innovation Lab logo. So although it's monolinear, we're seeing a lot of similar line work. It's really effective in creating a certain style or feeling. Here's another one of her pieces where you can see the way that these lines work on the stationary system. That bold red line at the top of the letterhead, and then that thin line that connects those blocks of red copy on the left. And then even these blocks that contain information on the backside of the envelope. So this is a really important tool, and you can start to see how they work in different ways, and different styles of graphic elements can create different feelings for the viewer. Here's some more of the work where you can see the simple line work and how it creates this very utilitarian feeling for the IBM brand. Images are an important element in graphic design because they can communicate so much so quickly. Images can be a static and utilitarian element, or they can be activated and interact with the typography and elements in the layout. So this is really important to think about. When we use imagery, a lot of the time imagery is just placed to reference something, so we can see something. It's more useful because we want to understand what we're looking at, and it's hard to describe things in great enough detail that image is no longer necessary. However, for this, we really want to focus on how can we make typography and image interact and become something that's more than either of their parts individually. And that can be a little bit challenging, but we can look at some examples of how we can crop and utilize imagery in ways that it becomes more than the parts individually. So here's a great example, a very simple example of a layout where we have this tall brick tower, and it is actually going in front of the brick by brick. There's an interaction here of the type and image that's really interesting. All of the other images are very straightforward, but the fact that they decided to have that tower go in front of the type and then even bleed out and expand beyond the bounding box of the sky was a really smart decision. It creates something that's really interesting. There's an engagement between the type and image that is more powerful than if that type just sat on its own. Here's other examples, more straightforward imagery, but if we look at duets in design and we look just below, you'll see these lamps that are playfully hanging off of this graphic element. So there's this line there that's denoting some kind of a bar or band, and then these lamps that playfully hang. Those would look very odd if they just bled or sat on their own and were hanging from nothing. So the designer did a good job of placing them in the layout and integrating them with this graphic element that really makes them feel as if they're actually hanging. Sometimes imagery can become type, like this example, where there's actually love honey and it looks like it's made out of honey. So that's something playful that we do, where type and image can come together in an interesting way. Although it doesn't apply on this particular assignment, it may be something that you want to explore in the future. Sometimes when we play with imagery, we want to treat it. So here's some imagery that's treated in monotones or duotones, where it's becoming more playful, it's becoming more moody, more stylized, and sometimes that can be an interesting way to go. You're going after a certain feeling, and by messing with the color of these images, you're able to more accurately portray the kind of feeling that you want. There's also an interesting overlapping of images in the bottom right, where their transparencies are being played there, and you're seeing these different images overlapping combined together. This is the work of Design Army. They are a firm out of Washington, D.C., and they do some really brilliant editorial work, and a lot of it often features a playful combination of image and type, like this one. This is one about Bond. It is about clothing, but this is themed around James Bond, and it's really playful. This man in this suit or tuxedo, and he's throwing the cigar behind him, and it looks like it's exploded that type, the explosive style. So they're playing with axis and really messing with the typography and making it interact with the image in this really interesting way. Here's another one, the tick-tock, where the guy's hanging upside down with all these clocks and watches, and then the tick-tock and the type is actually hanging as well. Or this knockout, where we see this guy and he looks like he's just beat up and knocked out all these people around him, and the type also is feeling like it's just kind of been playfully flying or falling down. This is a beautiful one where there's a more subtle interaction. This woman on the right in this silk organza dress, and if you look carefully, you'll see that the S in silk, that swash actually wraps behind her arm. So it actually feels like it's wrapping or integrating with her and weaving into her body, which creates a lot of interest. There's a nice play between the dress and the stylistic decisions of how that S was formed and how it plays with her body. So a lot of times we want to do these kinds of things when we're working with type and image. We want to create a lot of interest in the way that these things interact and combine. Here's another one. On the right, the way that the type is kind of wrapping around this woman and she's almost looks like she's floating and there's all of this type that's floating around her. Or here, this boxer, where we're really playing with axes and the type's running up and to the right. We have this bold, heavy type and then this strong boxer. Or this guy on the right where he's jumping and he's doing the splits and the type is kind of running out on axes from either side of him. So this is great examples of wonderful image and type play. And this is really what we want to strive for when we're working with imagery. It really makes things more powerful. Here's a simpler one where there's a megaphone, a bride with a megaphone, and then the type has all of these lines coming out of it upwards and to the right, which really emphasizes that diagonal movement that's happening from the megaphone. Bloomberg Businessweek has also done a really wonderful job of this. They have a lot of really great covers that rely on imagery. A lot of it's conceptual. Now think about it, this comes out every week, so it really challenges them to come up with these ideas very quickly. But this ouch on the left, where there's all of these ouches typed out, and then the band-aids are placed on top. Again, that's a really interesting play of type and image. Or the third one from the left, the shattered, where the image is actually fractured and shattered. So maybe these give you ideas of ways that you can integrate type and image in an effective way. I love this one too, where the type is kind of illustrated around this hockey player. Here we're looking at an isolated image. So this person has actually been cut out from the background, and it gives them the opportunity to run all of these graphic elements and typographic pieces around this hockey player to create something that's really dynamic and interesting. Or here's something that's really playful, these cropped images that are on these coffee cups. So we're seeing coffee cups, and then you can see how there's legs and body parts that are flying out of the bottom of the lip of the coffee cup. And then when they place them like this, they create this really playful kind of falling mentality that's really interesting. And then imagine if you were drinking out of this cup, you would have this playful portion of a black and white body on the bottom of your cup. So this is really a driving force for this brand and the design of these coffee cups. Or here's a fun one, this packaging for light bulbs. Although we're not looking necessarily at photography, we're looking at illustration. These are brilliantly done, where the illustrations are of all of these bugs that have bioluminescence, so they all glow or light up in some way. And then there's these die cuts or holes in the packaging that showcase the light bulb, and it makes this connection where it feels like the light bulb is connected to the actual insect itself. Sometimes we see imagery on packaging just to help us identify what we're looking at. It can be very effective, like that these are raisins or these are plums. So there's actually an image of whatever we're looking at, and it's helping us know what is inside the package. This can become really valuable for things like spices. This is a packaging system that has absolutely no type on it, but we can identify what these spices are by seeing this beautiful photograph on the outside that helps us understand what is inside. And so it also supports this really minimalistic direction here that creates this really sophisticated kind of luxe packaging experience. And then the classic example, the ice cream aisle. Half of the ice cream aisle is helping us figure out what flavor we want, and imagery is really a driving force for that. And so for Haagen-Dazs, it's been these little flavor profiles they've built out of isolated images that sit on the outside of the package. And that helps me know that I'm looking at Rocky Road or coffee or strawberry. And it's much quicker for us to make decisions based on those images than it would be to actually read all the text itself. So cropping changes what part of an image is seen, and in some cases the entire meaning of an image. Dramatic cropping can create interesting and dynamic layouts, and bleeding is when an image runs off the edge of the page. And this can be used to maximize the image area allotted, but it can also be used to ground an image or activate the edge of a page. So cropping is something that's a really valuable tool because by eliminating information that's seen inside of the image, it can really, again, change the entire meaning or the narrative of what is being said about the image. And bleeding is a wonderful tool to maximize the amount of space, but it also creates a lot of interest when things bleed. It makes a layout feel more expansive. So here's a great example of cropping. Here is an ad for a suitcase. And here the cropping is really zoning in on these different attributes of the suitcase. So on the left, we're looking at the handle and the lock. Next to that, we're looking at the wheel. And then below that, we're looking at the handle. So this cropping is really allowing us to focus on these different features and attributes that make this suitcase so successful. Here's an example of bleeding, where all of these images are bleeding off the edge. So the one in the upper left bleeds off the top, the one next to it bleeds off the top as well, and the one on the bottom bleeds off the bottom. And that bleeding creates a more expansive layout. It also maximizes the amount of space that is able to be used for the images. And then again, it also grounds them. It makes them feel more contained or more a part of the overall format of this magazine. Here's a playful one, a bag, where we're actually bleeding off the edge of the bag. So there's this graphic crop. It's actually bleeding and going off all four sides of the front of this bag. And that creates something that's actually more sophisticated, more interesting than if that graphic was actually shrunken down and completely contained on the front. This is a much more unique and sophisticated solution by using that bleeding as a tool to create interest. Here's one I love. This is for a very high-end event designer. And you can see this use of cropping and bleeding. There's this wonderful metallic band that contains her name and information about our company, but every time it bleeds off one side. And that really creates asymmetry and also a sophistication that's really important for the kind of business that this woman does. Here's one where we're actually cropping imagery into shapes. So if you look at the two at the top, you'll see that the imagery is actually cropping into an interesting shape. And sometimes that can be a great way to go. Sometimes by cropping the imagery into a shape, we can create even more meaning. Here's one where we're actually cropping imagery into typography. That can be an interesting way to go. Maybe you want to explore having really extreme scale and then playing with cropping or putting the imagery actually into the type itself. Or here's a great example of where this image of the Arctic tundra is actually cropped into the shape of Antarctica. So if you look at that white edge, you'll notice that you're actually seeing the edge of the continent. And so there's more meaning being provided here by having the imagery in a shape that tells us a little bit more of what we're looking at. So here's some movie posters, because those can be really effective to look at and see how they use imagery, because they oftentimes have to create a lot of impact and mood very quickly. And for this one, this J gun substitution is really effective. It really tells us a lot about what's going to happen here. It's definitely about a woman, a strong woman, someone who has a gun. It's clearly some kind of a Western movie. Or here's another one. I find this one really interesting, this 45 years poster, where the actual cropping of these imagery is really effective. They've put these people back to back. They're looking away from each other. And then there's this very exaggerated or emphasized kind of scene between them. And that tells us a lot about what this movie might be about. Maybe it's about the breaking apart of a marriage or the falling apart of a couple that's been together for a long time. But clearly there's tension that's being created here through the way these images are cropped and then placed together. Here's another one where the type is actually interacting with the image. Another example of where the type is weaving around this woman and it creates a lot of interest. On top of it, again, same movie, so we have this distancing between these characters. They're not looking at each other. They don't seem very interested in each other. But here I'm more interested actually in the way that the typography is weaving around the woman because it's a very effective combination of type and image. Or this one's wonderful, this Nina poster, where you have this duotoned image of this woman and she's wearing this wonderful headscarf. And then inside of the headscarf is all of this collaged imagery. So it's almost like memories inside of her head or other things that she's thinking about or, memories that she's carrying around with her of her past. And it's a wonderful way that the imagery is combined together to create a really interesting narrative or storytelling for the viewer. So here's another example of bleeding. This is just more of a magazine spread, but we're looking at these images of this dog. And if you look on the right, we have a combination of bleeding images and non-bleeding images. And it makes it feel more expansive, the way these images bleed off. It makes them feel larger. It also creates a much more dynamic and interesting layout. So bleeding is something that's really important that is explored in this section. It's something that I want you to evaluate its effectiveness and how you can bleed within that square and create a lot of interest. Here's one where imagery is actually being cropped into different shapes. So there's this kind of diagonal motif where all of these images are cropped inside, and it's really the combination of all of these elements that create a lot of interest. It's really the way they're cropped and split up and divided that makes this really dynamic for the viewer. So in this section of the book, you are now allowed to use images and graphic elements, but make sure they relate to the content in some way. You can use any graphic elements you like and can create an InDesign. It's all free game. You can even combine them together to create things like arrows or borders or lines. And since this will not be used beyond the classroom, you can pull images from Google for the image section. Just again, make sure that they relate to the content and make sure that you're looking at high resolution images. We want to avoid having pixelation or any kind of resolution issues in your book. So that can be a really important step of this process. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of where to go on the graphic elements in the imagery section of this assignment.